In 1905, United States Steel bought 9,000 acres of sand and swamp on the southern shore of Lake Michigan. Its engineers flattened dunes, drained marshes, shifted the Grand Calumet River, dug a private harbor, and pointed a new street called Broadway directly at the mill gate. Within 2 generations, 178,320 people lived there. More than 110,000 are gone now, but the mill remains. Gary was manufactured for steel. Its deepest losses began when steel no longer required the city it had made. Before there was a city called Gary, the southern edge of Lake Michigan was a country of sand ridges and wet ground. Wind lifted dry grains from the beach and carried them inland. Waves rebuilt what storms removed. Behind the dunes, water gathered in marshes where the ground lay only slightly above the lake. White pine and oak occupied the older ridges. Reeds, sedges, and shallow ponds filled the spaces between them. The land was not empty. Archaeological evidence places human activity along the Indiana dunes approximately 10,500 years ago. By the 18th century, the Potawatomi had become the dominant indigenous people along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, following earlier Miami communities in the region. The lake supplied fish and fresh water. The wetlands provided plants, birds, and protected passages through a landscape that could be generous to those who understood it and nearly impassable to those who did not. One of those passages followed the shoreline. When the beach sand was firm, travelers could move between Detroit and Fort Dearborn, the military post that preceded Chicago. When the lake rose or a storm loosened the sand, the same journey could slow from hours to days. Farther inland, indigenous trails followed the crests of ancient beach ridges because the lower ground between them held water. Those paths later carried fur traders, stagecoaches, roads, and finally rails. The geography was already writing the transportation map. The Grand Calumet River moved through this ground without anything resembling urgency. Its ancestor had formed as Lake Michigan retreated, flowing west through swampy lowlands before turning back toward the east and reaching the lake near what would become Gary's Marquette Park. It crossed a landscape so level that wind, lake height, drainage ditches, and human excavation could alter the direction of its water. Around it lay broad wetlands that stored rain and lake water in dark soil and shallow pools. To a farmer, much of this ground was troublesome. A wagon sank where the surface looked firm. A road built across a marsh required timber, fill, and continual repair. High dunes interrupted one route. Standing water blocked the next. European-American settlement increased after indigenous land cessions and removals in the 1830s, but it remained scattered. Small communities appeared at Miller and Tolliston. Families farmed the drier ridges, cut timber, harvested ice, or worked for the railroads. Nothing on the scale of a city took shape. Then the weakness of the landscape became useful. Railroad builders faced the same marshes as earlier travelers, so they laid tracks along the old east-west ridges. The Michigan Central and Michigan Southern lines reached northwestern Indiana in the middle of the 19th century. Other companies followed. By the beginning of the 20th, the Baltimore and Ohio, New York Central, and Wabash systems passed through or near the future site of Gary. The rails did not need the land to support corn or houses. They needed a continuous grade and a way around the bottom of Lake Michigan. Steel required a different kind of geography. A blast furnace consumed iron ore, coke made from coal, and limestone in quantities too heavy to move carelessly. A mill could not be placed according to where any one of those materials originated. It had to stand where all of them could meet at the lowest possible cost. The iron ore lay hundreds of miles northwest in Minnesota and Michigan. Lake freighters could carry it down from the upper Great Lakes in holds far larger than any railroad car. Coal came from mines to the south and east, moving toward the lake by rail. Limestone could also travel over water. Finished rails, beams, plates, and sheets needed access to the rail network spreading west across the continent. Gary's future shoreline sat at the hinge. Chicago was roughly 30 miles to the west, close enough to provide workers, money, customers, machine shops, and one of the densest collections of railroad connections in the country. Lake Michigan opened northward toward the Iron Ranges. Rail lines reached toward the coal fields, and then outward to cities that were laying streetcar tracks, raising office buildings, and ordering steel for bridges. The site had no natural harbor suitable for an enormous mill, but it had room to dig one. That distinction is worth pausing over. The land was valuable not because it was ready, but because nearly everything obstructing industrial use could be moved. If you had stood on one of the higher dunes at the beginning of the 20th century, the future would not have looked inevitable. Below lay scrub, marsh water, patches of timber, railroad tracks, and the slow Grand Calumet. Beyond them was the flat blue-gray surface of the lake. There was no municipal grid, no Broadway, no City Hall, and no mill gate. The shore still belonged more visibly to wind and water than to property lines. But corporations had begun reading landscapes differently. A marsh became ground that could be drained. A dune became fill. A shallow river could be straightened or shifted. A shoreline without a harbor became a place where a harbor could be excavated to the dimensions of the ships that would use it. United States Steel had been assembled in 1901 as the world's first billion-dollar corporation, combining mines, mills, transportation interests, and manufacturing plants under one organization. Its executives wanted a new integrated works in the Midwest, built as a single system rather than inherited as a collection of older factories. They needed lake frontage for ore boats, rail connections for coal and finished steel, enough land for furnaces and rolling mills, and access to Chicago without paying Chicago prices for every acre. Along the southern bend of Lake Michigan, those requirements met on sand. The Grand Calumet still crossed the site. The dunes still stood between the rails and the water. The marshes still occupied the low ground. None of them would remain where they were. In 1905, United States Steel purchased 9,000 acres along the Indiana shore of Lake Michigan. That was more than 14 square miles, enough ground for furnaces, coke ovens, rolling mills, railroad yards, a harbor, waste piles, workers' houses, and expansions that existed only as lines on an engineer's drawing. The purchase was not simply a real estate transaction. It was the acquisition of the first component in a machine. United States Steel intended to build an integrated works, a place where iron ore could enter at one end, and finished rails, plates, bars, and billets could leave at the other. Older steel districts had grown by accumulation. A furnace was built beside an existing mill. Another company added a rolling plant. Railroad tracks curved around whatever already occupied the riverbank. The new Indiana works would be drawn before it was assembled, with each department positioned according to the movement of material. Elbert Henry Gary, the corporation's chairman, described the project as a plant built to the most modern standards. The city that would house it received his name, although the naming came before there was much of a city to see. Work began in the spring of 1906. United States Steel divided the undertaking between two subsidiaries. The Indiana Steel Company would build the works. The Gary Land Company would lay out the town. On paper, those were parallel assignments. On the ground, one received priority. The mill came first. Horses and mules pulled plows through marsh grass and cottonwood. Steam shovels cut into dunes that rose 50 or 60 feet above the surrounding lowlands. Construction photographs show narrow-gauge tracks running beneath sand faces, cranes standing where trees had recently grown, and laborers reduced to dark marks beside the machinery. One surviving caption describes 16 separate cuts through the sand, some nearly a mile long. The sand was not merely removed, it was transferred. Material cut from high ridges went into ditches, marshes, roadbeds, and low sections of the plant site. Ground that had been formed by wind and water over thousands of years was sorted according to an industrial plan. High places lowered, wet places filled, and irregular surfaces brought to the grades required by rail cars and heavy foundations. The Grand Calumet River was in the way. Engineers cut a new channel south of its old bed, then straightened portions of the waterway through the property. Later accounts differ on precisely how far the river was moved, giving distances from roughly 1,000 feet to half a mile. The physical result is not in dispute. A river that had once wandered through the lowest available ground was assigned a new position because blast furnaces, tracks, and ore yards required the old one. There was still no harbor. Lake Michigan provided access to the Iron Ranges, but its open shoreline offered no protected place for an ore vessel to unload. United States Steel therefore excavated its own. The harbor slip extended approximately 5,000 feet inland. It was cut about 22 feet deep and 250 feet wide, with a turning basin at the inner end large enough for the largest lake steamers then afloat. A breakwater protected the entrance. Along the sides, docks and unloading machinery were arranged so ore could move from a ship's hold to storage piles and then toward the furnaces without leaving company property. The harbor was not built to serve an existing city. The city was being built to serve the harbor and the mill behind it. United States Steel initially directed approximately $65 million toward construction of the plant and town site. Most of the money, equipment, and engineering attention went north toward the works. Foundations consumed concrete by the trainload. Structural steel rose above ground that had recently been marsh. Railroad spurs multiplied between shops, furnaces, docks, and storage yards until the mill possessed its own internal geography. South of the work site, the human requirements were handled more loosely. Laborers arrived before permanent housing did. They included European immigrants, African Americans, transient workers, skilled tradesmen, and families following wages to a place that had not yet acquired ordinary streets. Some pitched tents. Others built shacks from boards, brush, grasses, or whatever the construction camps made available. Temporary booths opened along the line that would become Broadway, selling food and supplies to men working beyond the sand cuts. That order matters. United States Steel knew exactly where ore would be stored before it knew where most workers would sleep. By the summer of 1908, the harbor, tracks, furnaces, and handling equipment were ready to receive their first full test. On July 23, the lake steamer E.H. Gary entered the new harbor carrying the first cargo of iron ore. The vessel was approximately 500 feet long and could carry about 12,000 tons. Only 2 years earlier, there had been no channel for it to enter. The ship moved between the breakwaters and into water excavated from sand. It turned inside a basin that had not existed when the land was purchased. Ore came out of its hold and entered the storage system beside the furnaces. The route from Minnesota to the southern end of Lake Michigan had reached its final mechanical link, but iron ore was not yet steel. It first had to meet coke and limestone inside a blast furnace, where heat separated iron from the burden charged above it. On December 21, 1908, Gary Works produced its first heat of pig iron. Early the following year, the Open Hearth Department made the plant's first steel ingot. The sequence was complete: ship, harbor, ore yard, furnace, molten iron, open hearth, steel. Beyond the works, tents and shacks still stood beside stretches of disturbed sand. Inside, the first steel ingot cooled beneath a mill roof. The product had arrived before the finished city. In April 1906, while steam shovels were still cutting through the dunes, the Gary Land Company erected a wooden building near Broadway. It was 1.5 stories high, approximately 20 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with a cross-gabled roof, a porch, and an exterior stair leading to the upper floor. It was not designed to impress anyone. Against the furnaces, ore docks, and machine shops rising to the north, It looked less like the headquarters of a new city than a house waiting for a family. Yet nearly every civic function Gary required was placed inside it. The Gary Land Company occupied the upper floor. It was the real estate, engineering, and city planning subsidiary of United States Steel, responsible for converting the town site south of the mill into streets, lots, houses, utility lines, and sanitary facilities. Surveyors came through its doors carrying plats. Contractors received instructions there. Lots were offered for sale. Building work was supervised, and decisions about where people would live were made in rooms small enough to heat with an ordinary stove. The lower floor became Gary's first post office. Thomas Knotts served as postmaster, then became president of the first town board, and later Gary's first mayor. The first telephone in Gary was installed in the same building. At the rear, the city's earliest high school classes met, while construction continued outside. A corporation was upstairs. A municipality was downstairs. Children studied in the back. Gary's street plan began with a broad north-south line connecting the town to the works. Broadway would run directly toward the mill gate, wide enough to carry workers, wagons, streetcars, and commercial traffic. Fifth Avenue crossed it from east to west. Around those two streets, engineers placed rectangular blocks, alleys, civic spaces, commercial lots, and residential parcels. The alleys were more than empty strips behind houses. Gas, water, and sewer pipes could be laid beneath them, allowing repairs without repeatedly breaking open the paved streets. Sidewalks, drainage, utilities, and road surfaces were treated as parts of one system. The town was being drawn with the same preference for controlled movement that shaped the mill. United States Steel did not intend to reproduce Pullman, Illinois, exactly. The Pullman Company had owned the factories, houses, stores, and much of the civic life of its community near Chicago. During the violent Pullman strike of 1894, company ownership of the houses had made an industrial dispute inseparable from rent, food, and shelter. Gary would have an incorporated local government, individually platted lots, private businesses, churches, and property that could be bought and sold. The distinction was real. It was also incomplete. United States Steel remained the reason the town existed. Its subsidiary controlled the original land. It decided where the major streets would run and which areas received sewers, pavement, and company-built housing. It was the principal employer, the dominant landowner, and the source of the wages from which many mortgages would be paid. A worker could own his house while still depending on the company that had sold him the lot, financed the purchase, and issued his paycheck. The company town had learned to operate through deeds as well as leases. Approximately 800 acres south of the works were reserved for the first subdivision. It extended from 4th Avenue toward the Wabash Railroad tracks near 9th Avenue, with Tennessee Street on the east and Fillmore Street on the west. Between 1906 and 1909, the Gary Land Company built 506 permanent houses there in a selection of approved designs. That number is worth placing beside the construction camps. Thousands of laborers were arriving to build and operate the works, but the company erected only 506 houses during the first 3 years. Most were bought or rented by officials, executives, foremen, and other employees with sufficient income or standing. Only 50 were rented to European immigrants, many of whom took in boarders to divide the cost of the rent. The plan created a town, but it did not house the entire workforce. On July 14, 1906, residents entered the Land Company building to vote on incorporating Gary as a town. 2 weeks later, they returned to elect the first town officers. Only 33 ballots were cast in that first municipal election. The town board then met inside the company office, turning the building into Gary's first town hall. The arrangement contained the central ambiguity of Gary's birth. The voters were establishing a government inside property owned by a subsidiary of the corporation whose mill had brought nearly every voter there. The ballot box did not belong to United States Steel. The room around it did. Municipal officials continued meeting in the building until October 1907, when they moved to larger quarters. By then, stores and hotels were appearing along Broadway. Contractors were building beyond the company's original residential blocks. Workers who could not afford the first subdivision were finding rooms, putting up houses, or moving into settlements outside the Key-serviced grid. Gary was already exceeding the limits of the place designed upstairs. In 1909, the Gary Land Company sold its small office. Construction nearby, and the need for a railroad station made its original site more valuable than the building standing upon it. The structure was moved to Jefferson Street and converted into a private residence. It later served as a rooming house, an appropriate second life for a building born in a city that never had enough rooms for the people arriving. Decades later, it would be moved again. The house survived because it was small enough to lift, carry, and set down elsewhere. The city planned inside it would become much harder to move. Its streets, sewers, property lines, and divisions had already entered the ground. For a brief period, however, nearly all of Gary could still fit beneath that cross-gabled roof. Company maps upstairs, letters and pay envelopes below, students at the rear, and a ballot box waiting on a wooden floor. Broadway began near the mill and ran south through the center of Gary, a straight line laid across ground that had recently been dune grass and standing water. The numbered avenues rose as Broadway moved away from Lake Michigan. 4th Avenue was closer to the furnaces than 9th. 9th was closer than 15th. A man's address could measure his distance from the steelworks almost as plainly as a time clock measured his shift. The street names added another order. West of Broadway came the presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. East of Broadway came the states, arranged roughly by their admission to the Union: Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. On paper, the pattern looked almost ceremonial, the nation reduced to a grid and pressed into Indiana sand. But the map did more than organize mail. Between 4th Avenue and the Wabash Railroad tracks near 9th Avenue lay the Gary Land Company's first subdivision. Here, the corporation had built 506 permanent houses between 1906 and 1909. Streets were graded. Sewers and utilities ran beneath them. Sidewalks separated shoes from wagon ruts. The company even subsidized lawn care in parts of the north side, trimming the grass in a city where construction laborers had recently slept in tents. West of Broadway, company officers, mill managers, engineers, and businessmen increasingly occupied roomier brick and masonry houses along the presidential streets. East of Broadway stood more wood-frame dwellings, many associated with skilled workers and European immigrant families. These were not absolute borders. Gary was too new, too crowded, and changing too quickly for perfect separation. But the differences could be read in materials: brick beside timber, a private porch beside a rented room, a sewer connection beside an outdoor necessity. United States Steel did not simply sell some of these houses. Through the Gary Land Company, it offered mortgages to employees who could afford them. The arrangement placed a deed within reach of certain workers, but the same corporation now appeared on both sides of the household ledger. It issued the paycheck and held the mortgage. A worker could leave his shift carrying the wages that kept his family in a house ultimately tied to the company that owned the mill. For unskilled laborers, even that bargain was often unavailable. Their wages did not reach the price of a company house. Of the 506 homes in the first subdivision, company officials and executives bought or rented most. Only 50 were rented to European immigrants, and many of those tenants took in boarders to meet the high monthly cost. A 6-room house intended for one family could become a small dormitory, with beds occupied in shifts by men whose own shifts began and ended at different hours. The shortage extended beyond the company's streets. United States Steel had concentrated its money and engineers on the mill, leaving the immediate housing of thousands of laborers to improvisation. During construction, men and families had erected shacks or pitched tents near the work. One surviving photograph shows a hut made from tree limbs packed with grass and straw, with the foundations of a steel company office visible in the distance. Permanent industry was rising behind temporary walls. Those temporary walls did not disappear when the first furnaces began operating. South of the Wabash tracks, beyond much of the Gary Land Company's direct control, workers and private landowners built another Gary. It became known as the Patch. The Patch grew through boarding houses, tenements, wooden cottages, converted rooms, and shacks erected wherever a landlord could collect rent. Development followed Broadway south, but the company's services did not follow at the same pace. Sidewalks, sewers, utilities, drainage, and maintained streets arrived unevenly or not at all. Land speculators divided lots and rented buildings to people who had few alternatives and needed to remain close enough to hear the mill whistle. The Patch was not empty space overlooked by city builders. It was performing work the planned city could not or would not perform. It housed the men who carried bricks, unloaded rail cars, dug foundations, pushed wheelbarrows, cleaned machinery, and took the hottest and least secure positions inside the works. The mill required their bodies. The first subdivision had not made room for their families. By 1910, Gary held 16,802 people, nearly half of them born outside the United States. When the American-born children of immigrants were included, more than 7 out of every 10 residents belonged to a household directly connected to immigration. Croatian, Slovak, Polish, Serbian, Hungarian, Greek, and Italian voices moved through boarding houses and shops. Families created churches, groceries, taverns, benefit societies, and newspapers in languages the company's street signs did not need to acknowledge. African American laborers had also been present during the city's construction, among the workers living in tents and makeshift shelters. Their numbers increased during the First World War, when the mills recruited black workers from the South as European immigration slowed. By the 1920s, Mexican laborers were filling many unskilled positions as well. Each group arrived through a different history. They did not enter Gary on equal terms, and they did not encounter the same restrictions. Yet many were directed toward the same southern and eastern edges of the company's city. The first divisions had followed wages, occupation, and rank. They soon hardened around race and national origin through company job classifications, private real estate decisions, segregated institutions, and, later, discriminatory lending. Gary's geography carried all of them at once. Broadway separated presidents from states. The Wabash tracks separated the serviced subdivision from the Patch. Within those broad lines, landlords and employers made smaller divisions, house by house and job by job. There was no painted stripe across Broadway declaring where one Gary ended and another began. The line appeared in a mortgage document, in the width of a porch, in the presence of a sewer beneath the street. It appeared where brick gave way to timber and where the sidewalk stopped. At shift change, the same mill whistle passed over every roof. Workers came north along Broadway, crossed the railroad tracks, and entered the gates together. Behind them, the streets kept their distances. At Emerson School, the morning bell did not simply tell children to sit down. It set them in motion. One group entered classrooms for reading, arithmetic, history, and geography. Another moved toward the machine shop, the auditorium, the library, the gymnasium, or the playground. Later, the groups changed places. Desks filled as quickly as they emptied. The building seemed to breathe through its doors. Gary had been created so rapidly that nearly every public institution began in borrowed space. The first school had occupied a room in the Gary Land Company's wooden headquarters, under the same roof as the post office and municipal business. Within a few years, thousands of children were arriving from the first subdivision, the Patch, immigrant boarding houses, and the new streets extending south from the mill. A single room and one teacher could no longer absorb them. William Wirt believed that the ordinary schoolhouse wasted both space and time. Classrooms stood empty during recess. Auditoriums might be used only for occasional assemblies. Playgrounds waited while children sat indoors. Workshops, if a school possessed them at all, occupied expensive rooms for only a few hours each week. To Wirt, an unused room resembled an idle machine. He had begun developing his ideas while serving as superintendent in Bluffton, Indiana. Gary gave him something Bluffton could not, a city young enough to be reorganized while it was still being built. Its school board needed seats for a population growing faster than its tax base. Wirt offered a plan that was at once educational philosophy and capacity calculation. It became known as the Work-Study-Play system, or the platoon plan. In a conventional 8-classroom school, 8 classes occupied the 8 rooms. Under Wirt's arrangement, the same building could serve 16 classes. While half the pupils used the regular classrooms, the other half spread through the remaining parts of the school. They worked in shops, studied plants, listened to music, used the library, exercised, or performed in the auditorium. Then they switched. Academic work remained, but it occupied only part of the day. Reading, writing, spelling, composition, arithmetic, history, and geography were usually taught in blocks of 90 minutes. The remaining time was divided among shorter periods of science, manual training, drawing, music, literature, and organized play. Specialist teachers remained in their assigned rooms while children moved to them. The pupils changed stations. The equipment stayed in use. The resemblance to the mill was difficult to miss. Gary Works moved ore, coke, molten iron, and finished steel through successive departments, each equipped for a particular task. Wirt's schools moved children through classrooms, shops, laboratories, and playgrounds according to a printed schedule. Yet the purpose was not merely to prepare another generation for factory work. Wirt wanted children from laboring families to encounter things their homes and streets could not provide: books, gardens, swimming pools, musical instruments, tools, paintings, open ground, and supervised recreation. Emerson and Froebel became the fullest physical expressions of that idea. Kindergarten pupils and high school students could attend beneath the same roof. Froebel contained traditional classrooms, industrial shops, a print shop, a nursery, gardening areas, an auditorium large enough for 1,200 people, and 2 swimming pools. Wood shavings collected beneath benches in the cabinet shop. Metal turned on lathes. Type was set in the printing room. Elsewhere, children cooked, sewed, drew, sang, read, and tended soil that had recently been part of the same dune country buried beneath the mill. The school day stretched accordingly. At Emerson, younger pupils could be present for 7 hours, while older students remained slightly longer. Playground teachers supervised recreation before lessons, through the noon interval, and after the academic day. The buildings opened on Saturdays. 4 evenings each week, Emerson's windows remained lighted for adult instruction, athletics, meetings, and social activities. A school was no longer a building that closed when children went home. It became a public workshop that happened to contain classrooms. This mattered in a city where many parents worked long shifts and where dozens of languages could be heard within a few blocks. Froebel stood in the heart of Gary's immigrant district. Its evening classes brought adults into the same corridors their children used during the day. A federal investigator described a photograph of 19 pupils in which 19 nationalities were represented. The picture compressed the city's migration into one row of school children. But the line running through Gary did not stop at the schoolhouse door. In 1914, approximately 70 black pupils attended Froebel, yet they were placed in 2 separate classrooms with black teachers. School officials said other families objected to mixed classes. Black children could enter the building and use some of its equipment, but the system that rotated pupils through every room still determined which pupils could enter those rooms together. The arrangement was called integration because black and white children attended the same school. Inside, separation remained in the timetable. Beyond Gary, educators came to inspect what Wirt had built. So many visitors arrived from the United States and abroad that the school board eventually designated particular weeks for observation, allowing teachers to work without a continuous procession of strangers through their rooms. Reports described the schools in newspapers, magazines, government bulletins, and books. Reformers saw a way to relieve overcrowding without constructing one classroom for every class. They also saw public buildings being used from morning until night, instead of standing locked for half the day and most of the year. New York City attempted to introduce versions of the Gary Plan beginning in 1914. There, the system encountered protests from parents, teachers, labor organizations, and students who feared that academic instruction was being reduced and working-class children were being sorted toward manual labor. The word Garyized became both a promise and an accusation. The controversy slowed the plan's national momentum, but it did not erase its reach. By 1929, more than 200 cities across 41 states had adopted some portion of Wirt's system. A city that had not existed when the century began was now supplying schedules to school boards across the country. Back in Gary, the movement continued each morning. A bell rang. One platoon closed its arithmetic books, while another wiped metal filings from a workbench. Doors opened, footsteps crossed the corridor, and every room received its next group. Outside, the mill changed shifts. Inside, the school did the same. On October 6, 1919, Army trucks covered the 50 miles from Fort Sheridan to Gary in roughly 5 hours. Inside them rode veterans of the 4th Division, men who had recently returned from France. They carried rifles and bayonets. Other vehicles brought machine guns and field artillery. By evening, Federal soldiers stood along Broadway, the same street that carried mill workers north toward the gates. The first Federal contingent numbered about 1,000. Reinforcements eventually raised the force in Gary and the surrounding Steel District to more than 4,000. Froebel School's auditorium could seat 1,200 people. The soldiers could have filled it more than 3 times. They had not come to defend Gary from an invading army. They had come because the furnaces were losing workers. During the First World War, the mills had run under immense demand. Steel became rails, ship plate, artillery, wire, trucks, and shell casings. The armistice ended the fighting in Europe, but it did not shorten the hours inside Gary Works. Many employees still labored 12-hour shifts, with an average work week of about 66 hours. Some crews endured the 24-hour turn, remaining at the mill through an entire day when schedules rotated. The city could offer a company mortgage, a trimmed lawn, a swimming pool at school, and classes beneath electric lights. None of these arrangements gave workers a voice over the speed of a machine, the length of a shift, or the dismissal of a union organizer. Those decisions stopped at the mill gate. In 1919, the American Federation of Labor assembled a committee representing 24 unions and attempted to organize the steel industry. Its demands included collective bargaining, higher wages, an 8-hour day, 1 day of rest each week, and an end to the 24-hour shift. Union leaders sought a meeting with Elbert Henry Gary, chairman of United States Steel. He refused. The man whose name appeared on the city would not negotiate with the men who operated its furnaces. On September 22, more than 350,000 steelworkers walked off their jobs across the United States. In Gary, estimates suggested that roughly 85% of the steel workforce joined the stoppage. Men who had entered the gates together now remained outside them in Croatian, Slovak, Polish, Serbian, Hungarian, Italian, and English-speaking groups. The company kept portions of the works operating with supervisors, loyal employees, and replacements brought toward the plant under police protection. The word strikebreaker concealed several different stories. Some replacements had been recruited from outside Gary. Others were residents who could not afford another week without wages. Nearly 2,700 black employees already worked in Gary's steel mills before the walkout began. Some black workers remained on the job in an industry where many white-led unions had previously excluded them or offered little protection. Companies understood the division and used it, presenting employment to black laborers while allowing white strikers to direct their anger toward the men crossing the lines. Broadway compressed all of these tensions into one strip of pavement. On October 4th, a streetcar carrying replacement workers encountered a crowd of strikers on the avenue. Accounts differed over the first blow and even over the nature of the disturbance. Company supporters described a racial riot. Union accounts described a labor confrontation provoked by the movement of strikebreakers. Stones and bricks struck the streetcar. Windows broke. Police entered the crowd, and fighting spread along the street. The clash gave local authorities what weeks of picketing had not. A visible emergency. State militia units arrived to guard the mill approaches and principal streets. Public gatherings were restricted, but the following day, approximately 2,000 strikers marched without a permit. Former servicemen walked near the front wearing their old uniforms. The procession moved along Broadway to a mass meeting in a city park, where speakers demanded the release of arrested strikers and the removal of troops. There was an irony in the uniforms. Some of the same men who had carried rifles for the United States in France were now told that wearing those uniforms in a labor parade threatened order at home. Mayor William Hodges asked Governor James Goodrich for additional forces. The request moved from the governor to Major General Leonard Wood, commander of the Army's Central Department in Chicago. Federal troops were loaded into motor trucks at Fort Sheridan. By the end of October 6, Wood had placed Gary under what military authorities called qualified martial law. Civilian government did not disappear completely, but the Army assumed control of the streets. Public rallies and picketing were prohibited. Carrying firearms became a serious military offense. Soldiers guarded intersections, streetcar routes, railroad property, public buildings, and the approaches to Gary Works. Civilians were forbidden to wear military uniforms, preventing striking veterans from repeating their march in Army clothing. The city's geography now worked for a different kind of production schedule. Broadway offered a direct route from the neighborhoods to the mill. Under military patrol, it also became a protected corridor through which replacement workers could reach the gates. Union accounts later described soldiers arresting strike leaders and pickets, then making some of them split wood or sweep streets near City Hall. Whether every such account could be confirmed or not, the visible fact required no embellishment. Armed federal troops controlled where strikers could assemble, how they could move, and how closely they could approach the plant. United States Steel did not need every furnace operating at full capacity. It needed the machinery to keep moving long enough for hunger, rent, and winter weather to work on households without paychecks. The Gary Land Company still collected rent and mortgage payments. Grocers still expected cash. The company possessed mills in several regions, large financial reserves, and access to replacement labor. A striker possessed whatever remained in his kitchen. Men began returning through the gates. By the end of November, the strike in Gary had largely collapsed. The national stoppage continued elsewhere until January 8, 1920, when organizers formally called it off. United States Steel recognized no union and granted no immediate settlement. The 12-hour day survived the strike, but not indefinitely. The conditions exposed in 1919 were documented by a church-led investigating commission and became increasingly difficult for the steel industry to defend. Under pressure from President Warren Harding and the threat of federal action, the major steel companies began abandoning the 12-hour shift in 1923. That change arrived later, through conference rooms and letters. It did not arrive on Broadway. When the soldiers finally departed, the avenue returned to streetcars, delivery wagons, workers, and school children. It still ran straight north toward the mill gate. Gary had built it to carry labor to the furnaces. In the autumn of 1919, it had carried an army. After the soldiers left Broadway, the workers kept arriving. Some came from Poland, Croatia, Serbia, Greece, Italy, and the former lands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Others came north from the American South with suitcases, family addresses, and the names of men already employed inside the mill. Mexican laborers arrived in large numbers during and after the 1919 strike, first as replacements and then as part of Gary's permanent industrial workforce. Different journeys ended at the same gate. In 1920, Gary contained 55,378 people, more than 3 times the population counted only 10 years earlier. Nearly 6 out of every 10 residents were either foreign-born or the child of at least one foreign-born parent. The numbers could be heard in grocery stores, boarding houses, churches, taverns, union meetings, and school corridors. A child might speak Slovak at breakfast, English at Froebel School, and hear Croatian from the family renting the next room. European immigration slowed after the First World War and was restricted further by federal law during the 1920s. Gary Works still needed men for blast furnaces, coke ovens, rail mills, plate mills, machine shops, and yards. United States Steel increasingly recruited black laborers from the South and Mexican workers from both Mexico and the American Southwest. By the end of the decade, Mexican immigrants had become Gary's largest foreign-born group of steelworkers. More than 9,000 Mexicans lived in Gary and neighboring East Chicago by 1930. They established groceries, restaurants, churches, mutual aid societies, and households near the industrial districts. During the Depression, when steel jobs disappeared, local agencies and employers pressured many unemployed Mexican families to leave for Mexico, including people whose children had been born in the United States. Some departed. Others remained, sought citizenship, and waited for the furnaces to call men back. African American migration followed another rail line through the same decades. Black workers had been present during Gary's construction, but the First World War and the immigration restrictions that followed expanded their place in the mills. Families from the South moved into Midtown and other neighborhoods where landlords would rent or sell to them. By 1930, black residents made up nearly 18% of a city that had now passed 100,000 people. Gary had gained almost as many residents during the 1920s as it had possessed at the beginning of the decade. Houses filled south of downtown. Portable classrooms and permanent schools followed children into new neighborhoods. Broadway acquired banks, hotels, offices, restaurants, department stores, and theaters. The Palace Theater opened in 1925 with terracotta ornament facing the street. Hotel Gary rose the following year. Sears, Goldblatt's, and H. Gordon & Sons turned mill wages into coats, furniture, radios, dishes, and installment payments. Then steel demand collapsed. During the worst years of the Great Depression, production at Gary Works fell by roughly 4/5. Men accustomed to 12-hour shifts now searched for a single day of work. Mortgage payments stopped. Store accounts remained open because closing them would have acknowledged that the customer might never return. Gary had built streets, sewers, schools, and public buildings for continued expansion, while its largest source of wages stood partially idle beside the lake. The furnaces recovered before the city's confidence did. In March 1937, United States Steel recognized the Steel Workers Organizing Committee and signed a collective bargaining agreement. The contract established an 8-hour day, overtime provisions, a standard wage scale, and a minimum daily wage of $5. The amount represented more than cash in an envelope. Workers now had written procedures for grievances, seniority, discipline, and negotiation. The strike of 1919 had ended beneath military patrol. 18 years later, union representatives entered through the company's front door. The Steelworkers Organizing Committee became part of the United Steelworkers in 1942, while another war pushed Gary Works toward full production. Steel left the mill for ships, tanks, rail cars, trucks, bridges, weapons, and the machinery required to produce still more machinery. Workers arrived around the clock. Black migration from the South accelerated. Women entered industrial jobs, opened by wartime labor shortages. Housing tightened again, classrooms filled again, and the mill's night sky glowed above neighborhoods that had survived the Depression in its shadow. When the war ended, demand changed shape rather than disappearing. Steel went into automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, office buildings, pipelines, highways, and millions of houses. Union contracts translated that demand into regular wages, paid vacations, pensions, health benefits, and overtime. A mill job could now support a mortgage beyond the old company subdivision, a car in the driveway, and children who might complete high school without entering the furnaces beside their fathers. The gains were distributed through a city still divided by race. Restrictive real estate practices confined most black families to Midtown and nearby districts, even as their incomes rose. Mexican residents faced their own barriers in housing and employment. Inside the mill, union wage scales narrowed some differences, but seniority systems and job classifications could preserve others. Gary grew together without living together. If you had stood on Broadway on a Saturday in the 1950s, the mill payroll could be seen moving through the city. Buses released shoppers near department store entrances. The Palace marquee hung above the sidewalk. Restaurant doors opened and closed. Children carried paper bags while parents examined furniture behind plate glass. Banks cashed checks that had been earned beneath coke dust, furnace heat, and the noise of rolling steel. Gary's population reached 133,911 in 1950. 10 years later, the census counted 170 residents, the highest number the city would ever record. Gary had become Indiana's second-largest city. With enough people to fill Froebel's 1,200-seat auditorium nearly 150 times. The mill's employment peak did not align perfectly with the city's population peak. Around 1960, roughly 30,000 people worked at Gary Works, and the plant still employed more than 30,000 in 1970, when Gary's population had already slipped slightly to 175,415. One industrial complex issued a workforce of paychecks equal to about 1/6 of the city's entire population, though many employees lived elsewhere in the region. At shift change, those paychecks moved south from the lake. They passed the old company streets, crossed the railroad line, and spread through Midtown, Glen Park, Tolleson, Miller, and the blocks beyond Broadway. Above them, the mill continued to burn through the night. On November 7, 1967, 39,940 votes. His Republican opponent, Joseph Radigan, received 37,729. In a city approaching 175,000 people, fewer than 3 ballots out of every 100 separated them. Hatcher, a 34-year-old lawyer and city council president, would take office as one of the first black mayors elected to lead an American city with more than 100,000 residents. Gary had spent 61 years under the name of a steel executive. Now it would be governed by the grandson of enslaved people. The election was not simply the arithmetic result of a changing population. Before running for mayor, Hatcher had repeatedly pressed the city council for an open housing law, challenging the boundaries that kept black families from buying or renting in much of Gary. In the Democratic primary, he defeated the incumbent mayor, A. Martin Katz, and weakened a county organization accustomed to choosing candidates, department heads, and city attorneys. When Hatcher refused to let party leaders select members of his administration, powerful Democrats withheld their support. Some backed the Republican. The ballot was secret. The division around it was not. Gary's political map was changing because its residential map had already changed. Black steelworkers who had been confined to Midtown and other restricted neighborhoods were moving into homes farther south and west. At the same time, white families were crossing the city line into Griffith, Hobart, Crown Point, and the unincorporated land below Gary. Some wanted larger houses and newer schools. Some followed highway construction and government-backed suburban mortgages. Some left because a black family had moved onto the block, or because a black man might soon sit in the mayor's office. These motives traveled together, packed into moving vans that looked identical from the curb. The population figures concealed the motion. The census counted 320 Gary residents in 1960 and 175,000 Ford 15 in 1970, a decline of fewer than 3,000 people across an entire decade. Gary did not yet look like a city emptying out. Houses still held families. Gary Works still employed tens of thousands. Broadway still had department stores, restaurants, banks, theaters, buses, and sidewalks crowded at the end of a shift. But a city can remain nearly full while its economic center begins to move. Broadway ran south through Gary, but Interstate 65 could carry a family much farther. Beyond the city limits, the highway met United States Route 30 amid fields, scattered houses, and commercial strips with room for parking lots wider than downtown blocks. The land was inexpensive. New subdivisions offered attached garages, lawns, and streets laid without the soot-darkened brick of the mill districts. Retailers could build one-story stores surrounded by asphalt and place their signs high enough to be read at automobile speed. Gary had once expanded by annexing the land around it. That option narrowed in 1971, when the Indiana General Assembly exempted Lake County from the state law that normally prevented a new town from incorporating within 3 miles of an existing municipality. Merrillville incorporated that year along Gary's southern edge. The legal boundary did more than draw a line across a map. It placed new houses, commercial property, and future tax assessments beyond Gary's reach. The movement was already underway before Hatcher entered City Hall, and it continued after he arrived. His election became a convenient date to place beside Gary's decline, because elections happen on one night, while capital leaves by mortgage application, building permit, lease expiration, and store closing. There was no single morning when the money disappeared. Customers simply began driving farther south. Lenders financed houses on the other side of the boundary. Merchants examined traffic counts and followed them. In 1974, Southlake Mall would open near the highway with Sears and J.C. Penney as its first anchors, offering under one roof the same names that once pulled shoppers toward Broadway. Hatcher could appoint department heads, direct public works, and send police cars along city streets. He could not decide where United States Steel invested its next dollar, where a bank issued its next mortgage, or where a chain store placed its next building. Political power had entered City Hall. Much of the power to employ, lend, build, and relocate remained elsewhere. For one weekend in March 1972, however, Gary became the center of black political life in the United States. Other cities had hesitated to host the National Black Political Convention. Hatcher offered Gary, and approximately 10,000 people came to West Side High School, including about 3,000 official delegates. Red, white, and blue bunting hung inside the building. Vendors sold books, banners, and souvenirs. Television crews raised cameras above the crowd. Delegates arrived in pinstriped suits, dashikis, work clothes, clerical collars, and black paramilitary uniforms. The gathering contained Democrats and Republicans, socialists and nationalists, ministers and Black Panthers. Coretta Scott King was there. So were Jesse Jackson, Louis Farrakhan, Bobby Seale, Betty Shabazz, and Amiri Baraka. Muhammad Ali served as Sergeant at Arms, a heavyweight champion helping maintain order in a public high school, while armed civil defense personnel watched the halls. They debated school busing, prisoners' rights, wages, representation, the Vietnam War, an independent black political party, and whether to support Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign. The divisions were real. Some delegates believed black power could be built inside the two-party system. Others wanted a separate party. Michigan's delegation partially walked out. Yet the convention produced a national black agenda, later published as a 68-page document intended to turn 3 crowded days in Gary into a national program. Outside West Side High School, automobiles continued south toward the new town beyond Gary's boundary. Inside, delegates argued over how black Americans might use the vote to claim power in cities across the country. The applause filled the gymnasium and spilled into the corridors. The ballots remained inside Gary. More and more of the receipts were being printed beyond its border. At the northern end of Broadway, the main gate of Gary Works still opened onto the same furnaces, ore bridges, coke batteries, rail lines, and sheds that had drawn generations toward Lake Michigan. In 1970, more than 30,000 people worked inside the plant and its connected facilities, enough workers to populate a small city by themselves. 20 years later, Gary Works employed roughly 6,000. 5 out of every 6 jobs had disappeared. The mill had not. Iron ore still arrived from Minnesota. Coal still entered the coke ovens. Blast furnaces still reduced ore into molten iron, and ladles carried metal through buildings large enough to contain their own weather. Finished sheet steel continued toward automobile plants, appliance factories, construction sites, and can makers. From outside the fence, smoke, steam, flame, and the movement of rail cars could make Gary Works appear as active as ever. The change was inside the process. In the older mill, molten steel was poured into individual molds and allowed to harden into ingots. Crews removed the molds, reheated the ingots in soaking pits, and sent them through primary rolling mills before the steel became a slab that could be finished. Each transfer required heat, machinery, floor space, and men. From the pouring of the steel to the production of a usable slab could take 7 hours or more. Continuous casting replaced those separate rooms with one flowing operation. Molten steel entered a water-cooled mold, emerged as a solidifying strand, bent through rollers, and was cut into slabs without first becoming an ingot. The process reduced scrap, saved fuel, improved yield, and shortened hours of handling to perhaps 1 or 2. Federal studies estimated that continuous casting required between 10 and 15% less direct labor than traditional ingot production. Gary Works had placed its first continuous slab caster in operation in 1967, before Richard Hatcher entered City Hall, and before most Americans had heard the phrase deindustrialization. Basic oxygen furnaces and increasingly automatic controls accelerated other stages of production. A machine did not replace one worker standing at one recognizable station. It removed a sequence: the mold, the crane movement, the soaking pit, the reheating furnace, the rolling pass, and the crews attached to each. Technology alone did not empty the payroll. During the 1970s, the world acquired more steel-making capacity than its markets could absorb. Newer mills in Japan and Western Europe competed with older American plants. Electric furnace mini-mills turned scrap into steel, with smaller workforces and lower costs. Automakers used less steel in each vehicle. Aluminum and plastics entered products once made from heavy sheet. American steel companies, after years of expecting demand to keep rising, faced falling prices and machinery that required expensive replacement. Then the recession of the early 1980s struck the customers Gary Works depended upon. High interest rates slowed home construction and appliance sales. Automobile production contracted. Orders for flat-rolled steel thinned, and furnaces that had been built to run continuously were idled. Layoff notices moved through the mill by department and seniority. Some men returned after weeks or months. Others waited for recalls that never came. For a steelworker, the loss could be measured in a lunch pail left at home, a work jacket hanging clean for too many mornings, or a union card that no longer opened the path to a weekly check. For Gary, each missing badge at the mill gate removed money from several places at once. It removed a mortgage payment from a bank, a grocery order from a neighborhood market, a haircut, a restaurant meal, a pair of school shoes, and a property tax payment attached to a house whose value depended partly on the next buyer having a job. The city had already been losing white residents, stores, and investment to the suburbs. Steel layoffs widened every crack. Families with savings or portable skills left for work elsewhere. Some kept their Gary houses while looking, then sold them for less than expected. Others walked away. A vacant house lowered the value of the occupied house beside it. An empty storefront reduced the traffic needed by the remaining store. The city collected less revenue while still maintaining streets, sewers, schools, police stations, and firehouses, built for a much larger population. In 1970, the census counted 175,415 people in Gary. By 1980, nearly 23,500 were gone, a loss large enough to empty every seat in several downtown theaters many times over. During the next decade, another 35,000 disappeared. By 1990, Gary held 116,646 residents. In 20 years, the city had lost almost one person in three. Broadway recorded the subtraction in glass and plywood. Goldblatt's department store closed, leaving broken upper windows and boards across the ground floor. The large Sears building also stood empty. The Palace Theater showed no films, and the Hotel Gary, once the place for visiting executives and formal dinners, had become housing for elderly residents. On winter afternoons, long sections of sidewalk carried fewer shoppers than a single mill shift once released. There was no clean moment when Gary ceased to be a steel city. United States Steel had not packed Gary Works into rail cars and moved it south. The company modernized the plant precisely because it intended to keep making steel there. New equipment protected production by reducing the number of hours, tons of fuel, pieces of scrap, and workers required for each finished coil. That was the final shape of the company town's dependence. Gary Works could survive by becoming more efficient. Gary could not become smaller at the same speed. At the north end of Broadway, steel coils continued to leave the mill. Farther south, plywood covered the windows where steelworkers had once spent their paychecks. Broadway ends at an address that contains almost the entire history of Gary, 1 North Broadway. Beyond the gate, Gary Works still takes iron ore, coal, limestone, and scrap and turns them into sheet steel. Blast furnaces rise beside Lake Michigan. Oxygen vessels refine molten iron. Continuous casters draw glowing slabs through water-cooled molds, and rolling mills flatten them into coils. The plant retains the capacity to make millions of tons each year. It does this with only a fraction of the workforce that once crowded the gates. In June 2025, Nippon Steel completed its purchase of United States Steel. The transaction placed the corporation founded by Elbert Gary and John Pierpont Morgan under Japanese ownership after 18 months of arguments over unions, investment, trade, and national security. United States Steel became a wholly owned subsidiary, but kept its name, its Pittsburgh headquarters, and its American management structure. The United States government received authority over certain decisions through a special share, including changes to the company name and closures of major facilities. The old name remained at Gary Works. For the mill, the sale brought another owner and another program of investment. For Gary, it did not restore the 30,000 paychecks that once moved south from the gate at shift change. Modern equipment could extend the life of the furnaces, casters, and strip mills without rebuilding the city-sized workforce they had replaced. Gary Works could continue producing steel at 1 North Broadway while most of Broadway operated without steelworkers. The 2020 census counted 69,093 people in Gary. At the 1960 peak, there had been 178,320. For every 5 residents who once occupied the city, fewer than 2 remained. The loss was spread through entire neighborhoods. A house standing beside a vacant foundation, 3 occupied classrooms at a school built for 6, a fire hydrant serving a block where weeds had crossed property lines, and streetlights illuminating parcels that no longer held buildings. Gary still had to govern the full 50 square miles drawn during its larger years. Water lines remained underground. Pavement continued to crack through freeze and thaw. Police and fire crews crossed longer distances between occupied properties. Thousands of abandoned structures stood in varying stages of collapse, from houses with missing windows to downtown buildings whose brick walls had been exposed to decades of Lake Michigan winters. Removal became a municipal operation of its own. Gary officials estimated that the city contained close to 7,000 abandoned buildings. Crews worked through neighborhoods in organized demolition campaigns, disconnecting utilities, wetting walls to control dust, folding roofs into basements, separating metal from broken wood and masonry, and hauling the remains away by truck. During a 2-week campaign in 2026, nearly 60 unsafe houses were scheduled to come down across downtown, Emerson, Glen Park, Midtown, and the West Side. Some vacant land could not simply be cleared and rebuilt. Former filling stations, machine shops, dumps, rail yards, and industrial parcels required soil borings and groundwater samples before a new foundation could be placed. Petroleum, solvents, lead, and buried containers did not leave when a business closed. Gary's land had to be read below the surface, 1 test hole at a time. The river required heavier equipment. The Grand Calumet had carried industrial waste for much of the century, leaving its bottom contaminated with polychlorinated biphenyls, petroleum compounds, and heavy metals. Between 2002 and 2007, United States Steel dredged nearly 830,000 cubic yards of polluted sediment from 5 miles of the river's east branch. Across the 13-mile river system, later projects raised the amount removed or capped to more than 2 million cubic yards. Where dredging could not remove every contaminated layer, workers covered the riverbed. A cap might begin with 6 to 12 inches of clean sand, placed over mud that had received waste from the same industrial system that built Gary. The river continued to move above it. Below, the older sediment remained in place, separated from fish, current, and propeller wash by a manufactured bottom. The city was therefore not being restored to its earlier shape. Some houses were repaired, others were demolished. Some former industrial properties were sampled and prepared for new use. Others remained behind fences. Gary Works was modernized, while old mill departments disappeared. The steel company survived under a foreign parent, while the city bearing Elbert Gary's name learned to operate with fewer residents than it had counted before the Second World War. One small building survived by moving. The Gary Land Company building had begun as a 20-foot wide, 40-foot deep wooden structure containing the company offices, post office, schoolroom, polling place, and first town government. In 1909, after those functions moved elsewhere, it became a private residence. In 1956, the house was moved to 4th Avenue and Pennsylvania Street. It was later restored, placed on the National Register of Historic Places, and protected as Gary's first local landmark. The building that once contained an entire city government now stands in a patch of grass a few blocks east of Broadway. From there, Broadway runs north through the blocks laid out by the land company, past City Hall, beneath the rail lines, and toward the lake. The street narrows into the entrance of Gary Works at 1 North Broadway. Above the gate, the United States Steel name remains. Behind it, iron still enters the furnaces. South of it, the little wooden house still carries the shape of the room where Gary first voted to become a town. Between them lies Broadway, running across the same sand the company purchased in 1906, until the pavement reaches the gate and stops.